Well, hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam. I am a student of the Bible. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 22 years, and I'm a writer. My training involves biblical studies and theology and biblical languages, both Hebrew and Greek. I've been doing this thing in Genesis, and so let's keep rolling. We just finished Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. It's a fascinating story, and I got to say right from the beginning here, like I've been saying through a lot of this, is that there is debate about these opening chapters of the book of Genesis, on whether this is historical or this is some kind of fictional myth narrative. There's debate among scholars, and there has been for quite some time. One of the things that we need to take note of is the fact that the rest of Scripture does treat these narratives as historical, and so we do need to take that and weigh that. But recent scholarship, what we found through archaeology, 19th and 20th century scholarship has really brought to light some things, and maybe this isn't exactly historical. We can't find certain things. We can't, make sense of certain things from a historical standpoint. And so it has lent there to be now a debate that, this might actually be myth. This may not be an historical thing. And so there is debate on that. So I just want to make sure that I'm honest about that up front. But we're just going to dive into the narrative of the story and kind of see what's there to help us understand. And here's the thing. From the myth standpoint, what they would say is that truth isn't always the need for historical facts. That sometimes things are true even though they're mythic. And what that means is that something doesn't need to be historically accurate and just the facts to be true, that the truth behind it, the spiritual truth behind it, may be more true than just having something historically accurate. And what we're going to discover today is that there's some deep truths in this story about our human experience that are really important for us to dive into and to understand, about maybe why this was even written in the first place, to help us understand what happens when anger and jealousy and envy and rage take root in our hearts and we allow it to rule us, what that brings us to. So let's dive right in. Genesis chapter 4, I'm going to read out of the NIV, and then I'm going to hop over a couple different times to the Hebrew, just so that we can kind of see what's going on here, because this more than just the surface level. There's some deep literary things going on here that I think are awesome callbacks. And so here's what it says. It says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant, gave birth to Cain. Cain's name actually sounds an awful lot like what brought forth, the Hebrew word for brought forth or acquired. And so it's a play on words there that Eve is doing. It says, became pregnant, gave birth to Cain. She said, with help of the Lord, I have brought forth or acquired a man. And so that's what Cain means, basically, is that it's a word that sounds like the word for brought forth. Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. So Abel was a shepherd, and Cain was a farmer. He worked in the garden. He was a lot like his father, Adam. We're going to find out there's a lot of similarities between Adam and Cain through this story. And so Cain, he's got fruits and vegetables and all that kind of stuff from trees and from planting. Like, he's really working the ground hard because that's what the curse brought. Abel has livestock, sheep, cows, all this kind of stuff. And we're not told in the story that they're supposed to bring offerings, but they do. Okay, so this is going to become a tense point in the story for us as readers, thousands of years later. Okay, it says, in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. And to a Hebrew audience, to a Hebrew reader, they would be like, that's fascinating, because they would know that Abel brought the right sacrifice and Cain did not. And we're going to talk about that because as I read this, I look at this and I go, wait a second, how did they know what to bring, all this kind of stuff? So we'll talk about that. It says, the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. This idea of downcast is like depressed, he's sad, he's angry, he's mad. When my daughter was very little, we taught her, like 1 or 2 years old, we taught her to do this thing called the look, where she would put her head down and she would just put her eyes up with angry eyebrows. That's when I think of downcast. This is the kind of idea behind the word. It's like this looking down, but there's an anger in your eyes. You're sad, but still there's something behind it that's envious, jealousy, anger, all this kind of stuff. So here's my very first question as I read this. As someone who is not ever grown up in a part of a sacrificial system, and I'm looking at this, I'm going, where did God tell them that what was an appropriate sacrifice versus what wasn't an appropriate sacrifice? How did they know? It's not explicitly mentioned in this text anywhere that he told them. And so there's a couple different things. And maybe he told them in the narrative, he told them off screen. Like sometimes in movies, we're like, well, where did that come from? Well, that happened off screen and we're supposed to assume that. So maybe that happened. But I think what is more going on here is that this points to the fact that this text was written post-sacrificial system. Whether you believe that Moses was the writer of the Torah or that it was actually multiple writers that was put together later, all of it's happening post-sacrificial system introduction. Okay, and so the original audience of the book of Genesis would have been in a sacrificial system or wanting to be a part of a sacrificial system, but maybe they're in exile, so they're not quite there yet, but would have understood the sacrificial system that God enacted and enabled through the rest of the Torah. And they would have been like, that isn't right. That's not the right sacrifice to bring. They would have understood the sacrificial system and went, Cain's doing the wrong thing here. He's bringing the wrong sacrifice to God. But we, as people not a part of the sacrificial system, we don't understand that. So we have questions like, well, this does not seem fair, because Cain is a farmer and he brought the very best of what he could grow, of what he had. And Abel was a shepherd or a person who took care of these flocks. And he brought the best of what he had. Why was one accepted and not the other? That doesn't seem fair. It's not like Cain had livestock to choose from. But that's not the point. The point of all of this is that God isn't looking for just what is good enough. Okay, and a Hebrew audience would have told you this. Like, if we just bring the best of what we have, that's not good enough. It's not what God requires. When God says, I require this, I don't get to bring the best of whatever I have that doesn't meet God's requirement, and he's going to be satisfied with that. And that's what we learn through the rest of the Torah, is that when God says, these are the sacrifices that I require, you can't just bring whatever you want and hope that it was the best that you could offer. So hope that that's going to be what satisfies and brings favor from God. No, God wants what he requires. And so that's what a Hebrew person would have read into this story and would have been like, oh, Cain didn't bring the required sacrifice. He brought what he thought was good enough. And it wasn't good enough. And the reason that Cain gets upset and mad maybe is because he thought, am I not good enough? Is what I brought not good enough? And God's like, that's not it. Because look what God says, look what Yahweh says to Cain. It says, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what's right, if you just bring what I require, what I told you, will you not be accepted? Hey, real quick, I wanted to interrupt right here to say I forgot to add something in that I was like, oh, it needs to go right here. In the book of Genesis, there's something going on here that I think this story kicks off. Okay, in the book of Genesis, what you're going to find is that the writer of Genesis has a really big obsession with older brother, younger brother dynamics. And so what we're going to see always is the older brother is usually rejected and the younger brother is favored. I'm not sure what the exact reasoning is behind all of that from a literary standpoint, but we see it a lot in the book of Genesis. You see it with Cain and Abel. Abel's the younger brother. He is accepted. Cain is rejected. We see it with Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is the older brother of a different mother, and he's rejected. And Isaac is the favored son of Abraham and Sarah. We also see it happening with Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau.
Esau's the older brother, he's rejected. And Jacob is the younger brother, he's accepted. We see it with Jacob's sons. Jacob's older sons are kind of rejected, and Joseph, the younger son, is favored. Okay, so all through the book of Genesis, we see this motif of older son, older son rejected, younger son accepted. And so that is also what's playing into this story here as well. Just wanted to add that. All right, back to the video.
But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. And we're going to find out that this sin, this jealousy, envy, anger, all this stuff that he's going to be dealing with, God says it's crouching right at your door. And then he says a phrase to him that should automatically make bells go off in our mind. He says, it desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now, if you think back to the curse that God gave to Eve, back when they ate of the fruit, God said something very similar to Eve. In fact, what God said to Eve was this. He says, your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. And now he's saying to Cain, this sin that's crouching at your door, its desire is to have you or to rule over you, but you must rule over it. It's almost the exact. In fact, here's the Hebrew. Okay, I'm going to put it up on the screen here. The Hebrew from Genesis 4:7 that God tells Cain is this. It's ve'eleka tesukatav or tov ve'ata timsel bov. And what it means is, and for you, its desire is, but you should rule over it. Now, the words from Genesis 3:16 that God tells Eve is isek tesukatek vehu yimsel bake. And what the difference is the fact that who it's talking to and what it's talking about. So in Genesis 4:7, it says, and for you, its desire is to tesukatov, its desire. To Eve, he says, to tesukatek, your desire shall be. So the sin's desire for Cain is to take over. He says, Eve, your desire will be to take over. And then he says to Cain, ve'atta, but you, and to Eve, he says, vehu, meaning and he, talking about Adam, the man. So it's a different tense of the word to help us understand who the person is that he's talking about. And then shall rule versus should rule, and then over it versus over you. It is the exact same, as you can see, I put up the Hebrew here. It's the exact same wording as the curse. And so what we can take from that, a Hebrew reader would have we can read that and go, oh, that sounds very similar to what the curse was to Eve. In Hebrew, it's almost word for word. With different tenses, because he's talking to Cain about the sin that wants to overtake him and he has to rule over it, versus Eve wanting to overtake and Adam ruling over her. But it is the same wording. It's the exact same wording. And the Hebrew reader would have been like, oh my goodness, this is the curse and what is happening in Cain's life as a result of the curse. And I think what's going on here is that God is showing Cain, he's like, listen, sin is crouching at your door as a result of the curse. And you're going to have to rule over it. You don't let it rule over you. You're going to have to rule over it because of the curse. Without the curse of sin over them, Cain wouldn't even have to worry about any of this. But because of the curse of sin, and this is a callback to that, now Cain has to worry about these things like envy and jealousy and anger sitting crouching at the door of who he is, waiting to pounce on him. And if he doesn't learn how to rule over it, it's going to rule over him, and bad things are going to end up happening. And look what happens right after it. It says, now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? So he comes to Cain. He's like, where's your brother? And look at Cain's response. He says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Basically like, bug off, God. I don't know where he's at. Why don't you go find him? He's still angry at God. He's still mad at God. He's still downcast. He's still like, why do I have to care about this stuff? And this is what Yahweh says to Cain. He says, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." And now look at the curse that God gives to Cain. And we should automatically think back to the curse that God gave to Adam. But it's worse. It's like Cain is Adam, but worse. It's like it keeps spiraling downward even more. The curse keeps getting worse and worse. He says, when you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops. Adam's curse was when you work the ground, it's going to be hard to yield crops from it. Now he's saying to Cain, when you work the ground, it's no longer going to yield its crops to you. You will be a restless wanderer here on earth, going from place to place, trying to find the ability to do what you want to do here with crops. Like he's not going to be able to just settle in one place, kind of a thing. And this is a callback, once again, to the curse, but now it's the father's side of the curse. The first one was the mother's side of the curse. You're going to have to deal with sin in your life and rule over it. Just like, Eve was going to have to figure out like, this Adam ruling over her and her desire to rule over him and this tense relationship. Now Cain's going to have to deal with this tense relationship of sin, always wanting to rule over his life, and he has to rule over it. And now he's now have to deal with the curse of what happens when you let sin win and sin rule in your life. For him, it's all about this, working the ground, and it's no longer going to do what you want it to do. And it's a double down of the curse on Adam. And so it's fascinating what happens here. And then I'm not going to go into the whole thing about Cain saying this is too much for me and, what to do, all that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that in the next video. But I love the fact that in the Hebrew language here, and even when looking at English, we can kind of make these callbacks, but in the Hebrew language, we can really make these callbacks to say, wow, the curse is getting called back to again in this because of what's going on in this story. And so we should pay attention to that and understand that when we don't, and I think the point of this story for the Hebrew people and for us as we're reading it now is that when we do not take care of the sin that's crouching in the door of our lives, when we don't rule over it, when we allow it to rule over us, then it takes root in our life, and the terrible things happen because of it. And so when things like envy, jealousy, anger, all that stuff take root in our lives and they begin to rule over us, we can expect terrible things as a result. And so we have got to take rule over those things. And we're going to find out later on that part of this is why the law is given. Part of this is why the sacrificial system is given, is to help take rule over the sin that's crouching at the door of our lives. And ultimately, that's why Jesus comes to take care of in our life. And so from the New Testament when we read it later on. But what a cool way to start off. It's a sad way to start off this story with these two boys because eventually, Abel dies and Cain gets banished, and now they have to start over again. And in Genesis chapter 5, it almost seems like there's a restart that happens. Okay, but the rest of chapter 4, we have to see that there's some interesting things going on here that mirror something in chapter 5. But we'll get to that in the next video. All right, thanks for hanging out with me today and exploring this story with me. Give me a like, give me a subscribe. That would be great, and I'll see you in the next video.